Good afternoon. Thank you for being here after this very long and exciting day. Today I'm going to talk about platforms and law. It doesn't really rhyme, and I know law is a headache to most of you, but I still think it's important to talk about this because many of the panels today actually focused on the difficulty to find laws that actually fit the pace of innovation. And most speakers just said, well, law will always lag behind, there are no instruments, it's all about politics. Well, in my talk, I would like to offer you some solutions, because I believe it is possible to actually have some flexibility in the rulemaking process and make sure that law and innovation walk more or less side by side. But what kind of law am I talking about? We all say and we always hear that law lags behind, but I would just like to give you an example, a controversial one, I would say. So why do taxi drivers still have to learn by heart all the names of streets of London? We invented GPS for that, right? But they still do. They still do, and this is one of the arguments that Uber has used to basically say, well, this is an outdated regulation, we shouldn't comply with it. And you know what? They are right. You like it or not, they are right. And there are many more like this. There are many more regulations that are very outdated, that were actually drafted by our grandparents, thinking about the paradigm of the time. But the paradigm has changed. So basically today I would like to present you with a new paradigm, the platform deal. And the platform deal is one where you basically regulate a number of things. You regulate, for example, the ability to make an extra buck. But you actually set limits to it. Because as you see here, you don't make that much if you only work for certain platforms. You really only make an extra buck. And that's exactly how it should stay. So in that sense, the platform deal is basically the idea of trying to match your expectations as innovators and those of rule makers that try to limit you. And they try to limit you because it is important to have certain commitments in the way you approach law and regulation. So basically, I would like to invite you today to make a deal with regulators, to basically show them how the innovation process works and how they should respond to it with regulations. So welcome to the new deal. In this platform deal, the idea is basically to first show regulators how the platform works. And very often, innovators just come to regulators and say, well, this is what we're doing. Regulators should follow. This was actually one of the things that I heard in one of the presentations today. Well, regulators will not follow because they are influenced by a number of lobbies, they are influenced by different interests, and this works here in Europe, but also in the United States. It's all the same. Different lobbies will result in different regulations. But if we actually are able to explain to regulators how the new platform deal works, then we're actually moving a step ahead. So that's the first step. The second one is try to make the deal. Try to negotiate something which is not just self-regulation, because self-regulation is a very popular answer, and many academics actually say that, but it's not really law. It doesn't really work. It's not enforceable in many cases, and it just puts a great burden on startups. Big companies can do self-regulation, but how about startups? Some of them don't even have a legal counsel. How can you ask a startup to develop a self-regulatory mechanism? I honestly think this is a lie. So that's the reason why I think advocating regulatory flexibility might be better. So that's why I'm actually thinking about having a deal where you have top-down regulation that actually responds to what you want from regulation, what you want from law, what you want for your innovation. So first, I would like to explain what I see as the platform deal, as the new paradigm where platforms actually rule. And I would like to start with a kind of a controversial but sexy platform that will make you all a little bit uncomfortable. Tinder. We all know Tinder, right? I'm not going to ask who in the audience has Tinder because that would be a very embarrassing question, but most of you have for sure. So Tinder, I chose Tinder because I think this is the best example of the platform economy. You just swipe left or you swipe right. And it basically shows us how fast we want things to happen. We want our goods, our products, our services, even a romantic relationship to be available just in our smartphone. Nothing shows this better than Tinder. And look, they are even like now in the stock markets because of that. But Tinder also shows that technology is changing a lot, and at the same time, they are changing not that much in our real life. If we really think about it, Tinder is basically just doing what we used to do like in the old days. They're basically trying to bring us back to the world where we would meet someone living in our neighborhood. My grandparents met because a matchmaker introduced to them. And that's how people in the old days used to do. And this really interesting book by Aziz Ansari actually talks about this, about sociology of Tinder, of online dating. The idea basically that you use a platform to connect people with similar interests who live close by. So basically, we are replacing the matchmaker and the word of mouth by a platform. That's exactly what happens. The professional service of someone who used to do this for a living is replaced by a digital platform. And moving away from Tinder, we see this happening in many services, in many products. We basically want something which is very easy to manage and very fast to log off. And this is not only the case of Tinder, but actually of the general model of the platform economy. So moving away from online dating, what we have here in most platforms are three features. First, we have a platform, as you know, which is a middleman. And then second, we have the idea of a peer-to-peer relationship. And this peer-to-peer relationship is often common in the case of sharing economy. Controversial or not, is something that we see happening. And it's even valued because it's traded as the key to success of many platforms like Uber, like Airbnb, or many others. But we also have a third element that actually creates our trust in the platform, and that's information. We have access to an information, to a peer review and feedback that we didn't have in the old days. That's why we trust the platform. The word of mouth is replaced by peer review, by feedback. And these features make us trust the platform economy, and they actually are the reasons why it might be sexier to have a business on a platform than to have it just online on a regular website. It is the value and it is the magic of having an app. The problem is that we have different kind of platforms. We have the less controversial ones from a legal perspective, which is the case of these ones who are they are represented here today, where you basically get your products already pre-prepared at home, where you can actually learn music, as we just saw, or even where you can get food delivered. And these are not really controversial from a legal perspective. We don't have really sharing economy here. We just have a business, and we have a platform that allows us to have access to the business. This is mere convenience. The more controversial, but probably also more innovative part of the platform economy appears when we actually have collaboration between peers, and this is how this happens here in a number of platforms. One of my personal favorites is Kitchen Stories, which was also featured here this morning. And Kitchen Stories actually shows us this idea of collaboration between individuals, and not necessarily in a commercial way. People just share their recipes because they want to do that. And this is one of the values of the innovative platform deal that we have to protect. Another part is the Kickstarter. We all know Kickstarter. It's one of the many financial ways to start a business. In this case, this is actually a friend of mine who just started his business of swimwear because he just realized that American men have very poor taste when it came to swimwear. So he said, well, let's just show the Americans how European men dress when they go to the beach. And this was his idea, and he managed to launch it. I don't think not many venture capitalists would actually have invested in his idea, but Kickstarter made it happen. And we have many of this, where you actually see that institutions are being replaced by platforms. Professional services are being replaced by peers. And this goes on. This idea of lack of commitment, of access to whatever you need. Money, information, free time, all of that is possible in platform economy. But lawmaking is not based on these premises. Lawmaking is actually based on commitments, on the idea that we as humans need to have stable relationships with each other. We as humans actually need to have some trust, some kind of professional trust. And we also need to have these relationships regulated because we do not trust each other. So that's why we have a huge gap between law and the platform economy, because they are based in totally different premises. So that's why I think it's important to talk about my solution, or at least some of my solutions to solve this gap or to close the gap. First of all, I think any company, any of you, when you start a company, have to think about the legal problems of it. And this is just an overview of all the things you have to think about. And this is just not applicable, not only applicable to platforms, but any kind of business. You might want to think about taxes, even if you're not making any money. You might have to think about that. You might want to think about who owns the patents. Because you might think that you're going to be rich because you discovered something, but guess what? If you were a postdoc financed by a pharmaceutical, you might not get anything. Everything goes to your university or to the pharmaceutical. So in that sense, there are many legal issues that people don't think about when they start a startup, but they are actually issues common to any kind of business model, regardless of the existence of a platform or not. Then we have issues more connected to the digital platform economy. And this is the case of employment, right? This has been one of the most controversial issues in the case of Uber, but I believe this is something that we see in many platforms. Many startups don't know how to treat their collaborators. Are they independent contractors? Are they employees? Sometimes they don't really know, but this is something worth considering, and that's why many of you actually might need to actually go to a lawyer before thinking of this. And privacy security also, like some of the issues that have been dealt with along the day, because in these platforms, one of the problems, one of the information asymmetries come with this, with an inability to actually keep the data, or actually the possibility that some startups, some companies might actually sell the data to make money, because, or as we know, when something is for free in the internet, someone else has to pay the price for it, and very often are consumers the ones paying for the price for it. But the tough answer here, and the real platform model, actually relies on the public part of it. So whether you like it or not, Uber has been a first mover in trying to make the deal, in trying to negotiate with local authorities, because the problem here is that in most cases, you actually have local governments deciding the future of some of these platforms, because they are the ones that have the powers to do that. Although many laws are enacted in parliaments, it's actually the local level that decides on many issues. And that's the reason why you see different policies being enacted in different cities, because it's the way it works, it's subsidiarity. However, a common problem is the existence of outdated legislation and regulation. We see this, for example, in nonprofit media, where, for example, most media outlets in some countries have to become nonprofit media outlets, but it's very difficult to get nonprofit status, tax-exempt status, because simply the IRS in most countries didn't consider many years ago that journalism could also become a charitable purpose. So many news organizations are actually going out of business because they're waiting 2 years to actually get a tax-exempt status. So this is just an example of something that you actually see in the digital economy, that the switch to alternatives is actually being made more difficult by outdated rules. And in the meanwhile, what happens is that you have powerful lobbies trying to maintain the status quo, and on the other hand, you have startups and even large companies trying to fight for new solutions. And I would like to present you with 2 solutions that have been discussed right now, and which actually have been more effective than just relying on courts, which usually have very old-fashioned interpretations of the law. One of them is to actually petition. And Uber has been, a king in doing this. They have started many petitions at local level to actually prompt local rule-makers to actually take a stance. If you use Uber, as I do, you will probably receive from time to time an email saying, look, there is going to be this bill, please support it, or please sign this petition. And this idea of basically asking citizens to participate is innovative. I'm not saying that Uber is a good company. I'm not like taking a stance on Uber, but I'm just saying that this idea of involving citizens is something that can work for other platforms. It's a way of basically negotiating a new regulation with the local governments and basically saying, look, there is actually a group of people that support this idea. We should go for it. So civic engagement doesn't only need to stop when we have social rights. Civil engagement can actually focus on innovation, on basically showing that we as citizens actually care about it. The other form of solution has actually been on experimentation. So many of you have actually heard the word experimentation along the day, and it is true that when we innovate, we actually have to experiment. Well, the same goes for law. In lawmaking, we actually see that many cities are actually experimenting with new regulations. And this has actually resulted in the temporary approval of many digital platforms. So, for example, in the United States, there are many cities that actually managed to authorize Uber for a short period, exactly because they said, well, we're not going to prohibit something before we know whether it's good or bad, before we know whether people like it or not. And this has happened not only with Uber, but also with many policies. So across the country, Germany has also been very active in financial experimentation. This happened especially after the 90s. And experimentation and pilot programs are definitely not an area where Germany is unfamiliar with these kind of policies. Actually, in Europe, there are only some countries that have as much experimentation as Germany. And this is the case, for example, of the Netherlands, where actually local municipalities are actually also experimenting with citizen participation and with budgets. So the idea here is basically, if something can actually boost the innovation of a certain community, why not authorize it on temporary terms? Why not experiment and see what happens? And this is something that actually has worked quite well, and it is a way of basically showing some flexibility towards innovators, but at the same time give them a break. So something that I have actually argued in my work and that I think it's very important to take a look at is having this kind of regulation on experimental terms. Or basically, in the case of driverless cars, and this was something discussed like earlier today, instead of just saying, well, let's see how this goes, and then let's see what people like, will like, having a driverless car. Well, if we do that, the technology will never come up. What we have to do is basically grant a grace period, limit the commercialization of the product to a certain area. And by doing that, you are actually enabling innovation instead of just stifling it. The idea is just show some flexibility as regulators, and this is something that innovators can also promote by lobbying the right approach to it, instead of just having like the approach of like, just give us our authorization. This is not really compromise. So to conclude, and I would like to conclude in a happy note, not in a sad note, I think it is possible to have a platform deal in the sense that you actually don't just look at regulation or you don't look at innovation as something that you swipe left or you swipe right. Tinder also gets boring sometimes. So basically, instead of swiping left or swiping right, the idea is finding a new paradigm, finding something that might not fit your standards, but you want to give it a try. You want to actually show flexibility. So actually, the idea of the platform deal is to combine innovation and regulation by offering either a negotiated approach to it, and that you can do by lobbying local authorities, or by telling them, why don't you experiment? And this is something that municipalities have done in other fields, so why not experiment with innovative platforms? Thank you.